Good morning. Thank you all for being here with us this morning, choosing to worship with us. If you're a visitor, please stay around. Give us a chance to meet you, get to know you, talk to you a little bit. Before we get started this morning, Andrew, would you mind standing up? Andrew Simrick. Andrew just recently graduated from boot camp in the Marines. Andrew, thank you for your service for this country and for all of us. So thank you very much. So we are in the middle, I guess, of a series on the leadership and what the Bible says about our leadership that we have as a church. Last week we talked about a few things. This morning we're going to talk about our elders. But before we dive in, I want to kind of go back for a second to what we talked about last week. Last week I spent a good bit of time kind of telling you about the situation in 1 Timothy and some of the issues that were going on. We talked about how Paul, after he had already established elders, had came back through and found that in Ephesus there were a lot of issues and things going on. And so he leaves Timothy behind and he tells Timothy, I need you to work on this situation. I need you to look at and fix some of the issues that are going on. And right in the middle is where we see him kind of giving these things about elders, which we'll get to in a little while. But then we, after talking about 1 Timothy 3, we backtracked and we looked at a couple other things. And like I just mentioned, we looked at in Acts 14 that Paul had a habit of appointing elders, all the churches that he went to. Obviously, he couldn't in every one, and we're going to see a little bit of that here in a minute. But every time that he could, he established elders in the churches that he would plant and that he would start. And then we went to Acts 20 and then also 1 Peter 5. And both of these are situations where they're talking to these elders. And they use these three terms to describe this role. Overseer, some of your Bibles may say bishop, elder, and shepherd. And that's kind of where we talked about that. And then we went to 1 Timothy 3 and we talked about just one verse, which we'll kind of recap here in a second. But this morning I want to start with these three terms. I want to start with these three. And the first thing I want to do is I want to talk about two of them, overseer and shepherd. Because I believe overseer and shepherd, they define what an elder is to do. They define what an elder is to do. An overseer is a person that's charged with managing and with making sure that people or things underneath them are doing what they're supposed to. And that's the same as the word overseer means for us. That was what he envisioned for this role. And we'll get to 1 Peter 5 here in a second. But then shepherd is literally someone that cares for sheep, right? And that was a big deal for them. They understood what a shepherd was, and it's not, there's a lot of things that we have to go back to that context to understand about this role. But I think these two words define what an elder is to do. In 1 Peter 5, Peter writes, he says, "So I exhort the elders among you as a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as a partaker in the glory that is going to be revealed." So Peter says, look, I exhort you as the elders. I want to speak to you directly. As an elder myself, I want to tell you what you should be doing. And then he goes from there, he says, "Shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you, not for shameful gain, but eagerly, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock." And so you see here that two of these terms he actually uses as a verb in 1 Peter chapter 5. Now, elder, you think, well, why is elder not something they do? Well, you can't exactly elder somebody, right? You can't be like, all right, I'm older, I was baptized first. It doesn't really become a verb, but we'll get to that in a second. But these other two really, I think, define what an elder is to do. And I think this is a great passage to give you an idea for how to do that. Right? It says exercising oversight, not under compulsion, right? Not feeling like you have to. Not feeling like, you're being forced to, but willingly, as God would have you. And we talked about last week, 1 Timothy 3:1, that if you desire to be an overseer, you desire a noble task. And we talked about how it's not weird to desire that, because really leading in the Lord's church is being a servant. It's putting others above yourself. It's following the pattern of Christ, where He did not consider equality with God as something to be grasped, but instead came to serve all of us. So it says here, right, not willingly, but as God, or not, but willingly as God would have you. not for shameful gain, right? You know, we don't pay our elders, but, you know, there is position, and you could put it on a resume, right, if you were doing this for that reason. It says not for that reason, but eagerly, and not domineering, right? Not lording it over other people. That same passage we talked about, right? The people of this world, they get a position, and then it's, hey, let me tell you what to do, and let me tell you what to do, and let me tell you what to do. He says, but instead being examples to the flock. You know, you may be curious why I chose this slide as the PowerPoint thing. It's because that little triangle down there at the bottom on all this is that you notice there's one out there leading. I believe that's Jesus Christ. I believe He is our example. And then back behind this, you have different people that are following so close to Christ that other people want to follow. Other people say, hey, you know, look what they're able to do it. I should keep pressing on. And I think that's what he's saying here, is that elders of the church, they're expected to be the examples. They're expected to show the church, this is what it means to follow Christ. And I think these two terms define what an elder is to do. But today I want to spend most of our time talking about what an elder is to be. Oh, I guess, yeah, I forgot I had this up here. John 10, the shepherd. I want to just plant this in your mind, and when we get to the end, you'll understand why. Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees. And the wolf snatches them and scatters them. And he flees because he is a hired hand. Right? He says, I am the good shepherd. This is what it means to be a good shepherd, is that you own the flock. You take responsibility for it. And you protect it from ravenous wolves. Keep that in mind. We'll come to it later. So now, I think elder is where we're going to start looking at what should define who an elder should be. All right, I think it's pretty simple. You look at the word elder, this presbyterios, right, this Greek word. It literally was the older of any two people. It was a comparative term. You know, if you had two people in a room, you could have one that's 3 and one that's 30, and hey, the 30-year-old is an elder. But if that 30-year-old is in a room with a 50-year-old, guess what? They're not an elder anymore. See, between the two, it was a comparative term. And so in this context, when you're talking about the church, it's talking about men who are older, who have been through more, who have followed Christ longer. And see, I think that's the second thing, is elder is not just age, it's experience. You know, we're going to get to the list here in a second, but Paul in Timothy says not a recent convert. So if you have somebody that's 60 or 70, but they're a new Christian, are they an elder? Right? They don't have experience. They haven't followed Christ for a long time. So I think really that's the first thing that an elder should be. An elder should be someone that is experienced in following Christ. Someone who's followed Christ for a long time. Someone who's been through struggles. Someone who's had their share of difficulties in their walk with Christ. This is what I think he's saying by this term, is he's saying pick out men who have been through it. Men who have experienced what it means to follow Christ in a context or a culture that's hostile to that. Or men who have evangelized and who have been told no. Men who have been there with people as they have loved ones die. Look for men of experience, men who have been through it. That's the first thing. 1 Timothy 3. See, elders should not just be only experienced, though. You know, I said we're going to come back to this, but we talked about this all last week. Ephesus had elders. They had men who were experienced, but not just experience is the only thing. It's not just that, hey, you've been through it and you're still a Christian, but there's other things that need to go into this. See, there were men who were elders in title, but still caused a lot of trouble, and who did a lot of things that really just weren't acceptable. And so Paul writes to Timothy and he says, look, okay, it's good that we have elders and it's good that we've established them, but there's some other things that we need to hold them to a standard for. There's some things that they need to make sure that they are doing beyond just being the oldest in the congregation, beyond just being the most experienced in their walk with Christ. And keeping in mind that at this time, this was the first generation of Christians. You think about that. You know, some of these people here, they may be older in their faith, but that's only, you know, half of some of what we have in this room today. So he outlines in 1 Timothy chapter 3. Now, I told you we'd get back to verse 1. I do think this is important for this. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. You know, we just read that in 1 Peter 5, that it's not something to be done out of compulsion. It's not something where you take a person and almost like the stories of old where they just make somebody king, right? Jesus was even afraid that when he would come that, people were just going to make him king. Apparently they did that. I guess that was a thing. But, we're not just making people elders. We're not just like, all right, you're old, you're experienced, you follow this list. All right, you're an elder now. It's got to be something that you want to do. It's got to be something that you're willing to do. And I believe it's got to be something that really you already do before you get the title. But that's a different sermon for a different time. Verse 2, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife. Is to be sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own household well with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how would he care for God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders, so that he may not fall into disgrace, into a snare of the devil. Now, 1 Timothy 3 is not the only place that we see this standard, that we see these qualities, these qualifications of an elder. The book of Titus has this as well. But before we get into this, I want you to see that the book of Titus is a different situation. It's not like Ephesus where they had elders already. Instead, it starts out in verse 4, this is why I left you in Crete, so that you might put what remained it into order and appoint elders in every town as I directed you. See, just how Paul had traveled through Ephesus and he left Timothy behind, he also did this in Crete. And he left Titus behind to appoint elders here. And so after this, he goes through similar qualifications, but just keep in mind that the context was different. That these men were not elders before. There were not elders in this church to this point, but instead they're establishing them anew. But if you look at the list, it's still remarkably similar. If anyone is above reproach, the husband of one wife, and his children are believers, and not open to the charge of debauchery or insubordination. For an overseer is God's steward, must be above reproach. He must not be arrogant or quick-tempered or drunkard or violent or greedy for gain, but hospitable, a lover of good, self-controlled, upright, holy, and disciplined. He must hold firm to the trustworthy word as taught, so that he may be able to give instruction in sound doctrine, and also to rebuke those who contradict it. So here we have two passages telling us what we are to look for when we're deciding who an elder should be. So let's compare them. I don't know if you've ever done that. Let's put them together. First you start out and you see there's actually a big chunk of it that is the exact same wording. Above reproach, husband of one wife, husband of one wife. Hospitable, self-controlled, not a drunkard, not violent but gentle. Right? All those are exactly the same wording. And scholars really think that Titus was written pretty soon after the Timothys. So it makes sense, right? Paul is sitting down, and as he's thinking about this in one church, he's like, hey, this is happening in another. I need to write this down. So we go on. Not quarrelsome. You start to see ones that aren't the exact wording, but they're the same idea. Right? Not quarrelsome. Not quick-tempered. Not a lover of money, not greedy for gain. Manage his household well. His children are believers. Right? And then even the qualifications of what it means to manage a household well. And there's qualifications for his children being believers. But then you get to ones like this, where able to teach in 1 Timothy 3 is almost a paragraph in Titus, where he goes on and he says, hold firm to the trustworthy word, able to give instruction in sound doctrine, able to rebuke those who contradict it. But then you go on and you see, well, there's some that don't exactly line up. Well, maybe they're close, right? Respectable, upright, okay, similar, different wording again. Sober-minded, disciplined, okay, similar. Then you got holy, which is kind of by itself in Titus, not mentioned in Timothy. Right? Not a recent convert. Well, not arrogant. I mean, he goes on, he says, not a recent convert so that he doesn't get puffed up And Titus, he just flat out says, don't be arrogant. But then you got well thought of by outsiders. Okay, maybe that's a lover of good. But as you start to compare this, you see they're really remarkably similar. There's a lot of things that are similar, but there's two little things that I want to point out about this that I think to be true. Is one, each context might require something a little different. You know, you look at that, right? 1 Timothy 3, it wasn't the same as Titus 1. And it makes sense because they're different situations. In Ephesus, you have people who are coming from this pagan background who worship, 20 or more different gods. But in Crete, we read about Crete, it's got its own share of problems too. And so the context is a little bit different there. But look at this. In the list of Timothy, Paul he ends with these two things, right? Not be a recent convert. And then also that he must be well thought of by outsiders. One of the things that tends to pop up in Timothy is that he seems to be really concerned with the reputation that these leaders in the church are giving Ephesus. That they're looking at it and they're saying, this is the church? Look at this. Do not admit a charge against an elder except on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. That means there had to have been people coming up and saying, hey, your elders, they're a mess. This is your church. Your elder was caught, he was a drunkard. I mean, he that's on the list. He was out in the town drunk as a skunk. It was a mess. And so Paul ends 1 Timothy 3 by saying, look, they don't need to be a recent convert because they're going to get puffed up. They're going to think they know everything. And he says they got to be well thought of by the people outside the church. So that context, he had that thing going on, right? And like I say, 1 Timothy, it shows a picture of a church that was a mess. But then you look at Titus, and he ends with, I said it was just able to teach in Timothy, but here in Titus, he must hold firm to the trustworthy word as was taught, so that he may be able to give instruction in sound doctrine and also rebuke those who contradict it. And in Titus, he actually tells us immediately after why. Because he says, for there are many who are insubordinate, empty talkers and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision party. They must be silenced, since they are upsetting whole families by teaching for shameful gain what they ought not to teach. See, in one context, you have elders who are giving a bad reputation for the church. And in the other context, you don't have elders yet, but that there's people that are teaching things that are contrary to God's Word. And so Paul says to Titus, he says, make sure you get men who are able to teach this sound doctrine and who are able to rebuke, because these people need to know what's right and wrong. These people need to know what has been taught. So you see, one context may require some of these qualifications to be more important. And then another one, okay, these are more important. But that's the first thing. The second thing is I don't think this is a rigid checklist. This is not like a mechanic going over a car and saying, all right, is the oil filled? Yeah, it's filled. Is this here? Is this here? And I'll make it easy for you. Let's look at some of these, right? To what degree should someone be holy? How holy is holy enough to be an elder? All right, what about hospitable? I have people over once a month. I'm hospitable. Once a year? Once a week? How hospitable is hospitable? Who decides how hospitable? Above reproach? Woo! There was that one time. I got lots of reproach for that one. I'm talking about myself. Actually, it's been several times. But, how above reproach you got to be? Does that mean you just flat out nobody can bring any kind of charge against you for a mistake? And then, self-controlled. Well, he lost it. Elder lost his temper once. Now we got to kick him out. This is not the same. Now keep in mind, there are ones that are pretty straightforward. Don't be a drunkard, right? That one's, okay, do you get drunk? Do people see you getting drunk? Okay, yes. You're out. And there's obvious ones that, like I say, not all these are that way. But this list as a whole is not something that you just go down and say, okay, done. Because when you get to these, there's a lot of them where how good do they have to be? And not only that, what about some of the things that aren't on this list? You know, if you think about it, if you really look at this list, this is not a list of all the Christian virtues. This is not a list of things that, hey, you know, this is exactly what a good Christian should be. I mean, there's a lot of things that are left off this list that aren't there. You know, what about the fact that the two lists aren't identical? You know, when you look at all this, this is not something that's meant to be, all right, here, boom, right? So, if this is not meant to be a checklist, if this is something that should be slightly different for each context, then what do we do with these two lists? What exactly do these two lists mean? And for this, I want to go back to Acts chapter 6. What do we do with this? Acts chapter 6. Now, in Acts chapter 6, the apostles, you can call them, some of them were elders maybe at this time, we're not exactly sure, but they had this need come up. And in Acts chapter 6, most scholars, most people that study this believe this is the first time that we see appointed deacons. Okay? This is the first time that they appointed deacons. Now, because of that, because I consider the job of elder to be slightly more responsibility and more careful in selecting elders than deacons, and I think we'll see that if you keep going in 1 Timothy 3, I think what happens here we can also apply to the appointing of elders. And so in Acts chapter 3, they're appointing deacons, and I want you to see what they say. Therefore, brothers, pick out among you 7 men of good repute, good reputation, right? Full of the Spirit and of wisdom, whom we will appoint to this duty. He says, here's what you need to do. We're going to appoint some deacons. Here's what you're looking for. Make sure they have a good reputation. Make sure they're full of the Spirit and full of wisdom. Now, those lists make a little more sense now. Because think about it. All of these things that are in these lists are things you can look at from the outside. Things that you can look at and say, do they seem to be someone that's hospitable? If me as an outsider judging, if I'm saying I want to recommend this person for this leadership position, would I say that they've been hospitable? Would I say that they are self-controlled compared to the rest of us, right? Experience, that being an elder, someone that leads the way, someone that's an example. You look at these and now it's not a checklist, but instead you're looking at it and you're saying, okay, who is the people in our midst that lead the way in these things? Who has a good reputation? Who do people in the church look up to? And you look at these lists. And that's a good way to look at it. As you say, who in our church does these things? Who follows? You know, there's, like I say, there's the obvious ones, but who has a good reputation? And you look through that list. But then you go on and it's full of the Spirit. You go to Galatians chapter 5 and you say, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against there is no such law. And you say, all right, do I see these fruits in a person? Do I see this person being someone that's full of love, full of joy, full of peace? And then finally, you look for somebody that's full of wisdom. James 3:17 tells us, the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. See, I think we go back to Acts chapter 6, and I think this fits in perfectly with what they did there. It's first you look and you say, does this person have a good reputation? If they're a drunkard, guess what? The story stops there. You go no further, right? That's what those lists do, is it helps you to see, do they have a bad reputation? If they do, they don't need to be considered for this position. And then you start to look at some of the other things and you say, all right, do these traits fit in? Do they have a good reputation in this sense? Then after that, you move and you look, okay, now when I look in their lives, do I see the fruit of God's Spirit? Do I see the fruit of someone that's being changed by God's Word, who's following Christ and becoming more like Him? And then finally, you look for somebody that's full of wisdom, this type of wisdom, the wisdom that's from above. And you go through those things, and you do all of this with prayer. You consider all these passages, and you look even at 1 Peter 5 and Acts 20, and you say, all right, who among us is God preparing to lead in this way? And keep in mind, lots of people are going to be humble, right? Lots of people are going to say, well, I don't know if I can do that. You know, I joked about it last week when I was asked to be a preacher. I was not thinking, yeah, I'll be the best one yet. You know, I definitely didn't think that. In fact, I was like, you really want to hear me every Sunday? Sorry for you. Right, you're going to have some of that attitude. But God is the one that prepares elders. God is the one who's been working on these men and preparing them for this moment. It's up to us through prayer to determine if this is what God has been working towards. Are there men in this congregation that we see these things to be true? Are there men in this congregation that we see that they're already leading without the title? This is what this process is all about. It's about us as the church body going to these passages and considering the men of this congregation and saying, who among us is our elder? Who among us is already shepherding us? Who among us is ready and being prepared by God for this? So this morning, this is my recommendation. You take these lists, you read through them, you consider the things that I've said. I may be wrong about some of this. You know, Paul did not, really nowhere in the New Testament do we have the exact steps of how this is supposed to go. You know, I said it's not a checklist because we don't get a checklist. If we were looking for a checklist, you're not going to find one. But instead, you can piece this together and you can start to get an idea for how Paul did it and how he was instructing Timothy and Titus to do this in the congregations they were in. As we all come together, we all study this, we all pray, and we say, these are the men that we believe could lead us. These are the men that we believe can lead us because they're following Christ so closely. They're already towards the tip of that triangle. That's what we're looking for. Now, this is not exactly a sermon designed to get you to think about becoming a Christian. But because of what we believe about God, we know that the invitation is always open. It's not just a time when I get up and say a few things. If at any point, through our study of elders and deacons, you've been thinking, you know what, I've really been putting this off. I look at the men in this congregation and I realize that, I need to follow their lead. I need to step up and I need to either become a Christian or I need to pray that God can change me into who I need to be. That invitation is open all the time. But we say it at the end of every sermon because we want you to know that. We want you to remember that at any time, if you need to come forward and get your life right with God, we want you to do that now. Whether that's when we're singing or whether that's 2 hours from now, 5 days from now, whenever, that invitation is always open. So if you need to come to become a Christian or need the prayers of the church, come as we stand and sing.